Today we're going to do the 5.1 notes. So Unit 5 is all about reproduction and heredity, which is going to include cell division and also sexual versus asexual reproduction and how we pass on traits from parent to offspring in plants and animals. So first of all, let's talk about why a cell might divide. Okay. 5.1 is all about cell division called mitosis. And an organism might go through mitosis and those cells might divide for a couple of different reasons. The first reason a cell might divide is for the organism to reproduce. If it's a single celled organism, meaning it's unicellular, it only is made of one cell, that's the whole organism, then it's going to need to divide in order to make more copies of itself. So in order to make more of its organism, it needs to continue to divide. Another reason that cells might divide is for growth, for the organism to grow. When you were a baby, you had fewer cells than you have now. Or a sapling, a tiny little, tiny little baby plant needs more cells as it grows and grows and grows into a big giant oak tree. So as that organism grows, the cells don't get bigger themselves, but it gets more and more and more cells. In order to get more cells, then those cells that it has needs to divide. Another reason that cells might divide is for an organism to repair any damage that might be done. So if you have like a plant where like a leaf gets torn off or damage to a tree limb, something like that, those cells need to divide to repair that area. If you get a cut, your cells divide to fix that cut. And typically speaking, our skin cells are pretty good at dividing pretty quickly. This picture here is from our textbook, so you should have your books open to 294 to fill this in. On the left-hand side here, we have a paramecium, which is a little single-celled organism, and it is dividing to make more copies of itself. So, of course, the role of cell division here is reproduction. This paramecium is dividing for reproductive purposes to make more copies of itself. On the right-hand side, we have a starfish. Starfish can do this cool thing called regeneration. So if there's damage to one of its limbs, where maybe one might get bitten off by an animal, something like that, it can actually regrow that limb. So you can see here in this picture of the starfish, it's got two limb buds that are growing. So first of all, the cells needed to divide to repair that injured area. But now that it seems to be pretty well repaired, those limbs, those little starfish legs need to grow. And so those starfish legs are getting more and more and more cells as that starfish is growing those legs. This is a video that talks about starfish regeneration and how it can affect the population.
The sea stars can all regenerate, even the brittle stars can regenerate. And it depends on how much you lose. So for instance, if they lost just one leg, it seals up very quickly that portion of the leg. And then there are stem cells in there, just like there are stem cells in people and lots of other animals. Like you find in blue-bellied lizards, when they lose their tail, they can grow that back. And those stem cells will reactivate and they'll regenerate that arm. It'll form as a little limb bud. Sometimes it bifurcates and you'll find sea stars that have 6 legs instead of just sea stars that have 5. That's not uncommon. And they can lose up to 3 legs. As long as they can still move around and you haven't damaged the central disc to where they can still eat, they can regenerate up to 3 legs. We had a lot of problems on the East Coast. Back in the 1940s, the oyster fishermen used to pull them up when they were dragging fish nets on the bottoms of the oyster beds. They'd pull the oysters up on the boat, and they hated the sea stars because they knew the sea stars ate the oysters, and so they'd cut the sea stars' legs off, and they'd throw them back over the side of the boat. And they doubled the sea star population in less than a decade. It decimated the oyster fishery, and they actually put themselves out of business.
So those oyster fishermen learned a pretty tough lesson that day, where they were thinking that they were killing the starfish by cutting them in half and just throwing the waste back overboard, when really each half of that starfish would regenerate to become a full starfish. So really they just doubled the starfish population, which then those starfish ate the oysters that they were trying to get for their jobs. So kind of a crazy situation that all happens because of cell division. So what happens to our genes in a cell when cells divide? So genetic material is all found in our DNA. And DNA is just the code. It's like the kind of like the computer code that is written that makes up who you are. Okay, so if somebody reads your DNA, they'd be able to tell that you're a human, and they would even be able to tell, how tall you are, what color hair you have, what color eyes you have. It's the code that makes you you. So all of our genes, all of our genetic material is located in our DNA. The important DNA that we have is mostly located in our nucleus of each cell. So each cell has a nucleus, and in that nucleus contains all of this DNA. Most of the time, that DNA just looks like a stringy ball of yarn, just like a mess of like spaghetti kind of stuff, most of the time. Sometimes that DNA will organize itself into what's called a chromosome. And I know you guys have heard about chromosomes. You maybe don't know exactly what they are. But basically, a chromosome is when that stringy ball of DNA wraps itself around some proteins and makes this X shape that you see here on this slide. Chromosome is made up of two legs that are called a chromatid. So these legs are each called a chromatid, and they are held together in the middle by a little belt kind of thing called a centromere. Okay, each chromosome for an organism that is sexually reproducing, so something that can't just reproduce by itself. So each chromosome has a partner, a friend that carries the same or very similar information to it. Okay, so that's what we call sister chromosomes. So typically, before a cell divides, those chromosomes need to copy themselves, because when one cell divides, a parent cell divides into two daughter cells, you want those two daughter cells to be exact copies of the parent. So that DNA, all of that genetic material, needs to copy itself first. So we have our parent cell with all of its DNA in the nucleus. That DNA needs to double so that each daughter cell can get a good copy of that genetic material.
What is a chromosome? To solve problems that explain and predict traits and variations, we first have to understand cells. All living organisms are composed of cells. Cells work like little factories doing all the jobs inside your body that are needed to keep your body functioning. Your body is made up of many different kinds of cells, such as skin cells, muscle cells, and nerve cells. Some cells look like squashed bricks, some look like donuts, and many have irregular shapes. However, every cell, no matter what its job, has the same basic parts. All human cells have an outer border that's the boundary of the cell, called the cell membrane. A liquid material called cytoplasm is inside the cell membrane, and there's a large structure suspended in the cytoplasm called the nucleus. The nucleus is the part of a cell that contains the genetic information. The nucleus is surrounded by a nuclear membrane that, like the cell membrane, makes a boundary around the nucleus. Now let's explore chromosomes. Chromosomes are thread-like structures located inside the nucleus of animal and plant cells. Each chromosome is made of protein and a single molecule of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. Passed from parents to offspring, DNA contains the specific instructions that make each type of living creature unique. The term chromosome comes from the Greek words for color, chroma, and body, soma. Scientists gave this name to chromosomes because they are cell structures, or bodies, that are strongly stained by some colorful dyes used in research. So what do chromosomes actually do? The unique structure of chromosomes keeps DNA tightly wrapped around spool-like proteins called histones. Without such packaging, DNA molecules would be too long to fit inside cells. For an organism to grow and function properly, cells must constantly divide to produce new cells to replace old, worn-out cells. During cell division, it's essential that DNA remains intact and evenly distributed among cells. Chromosomes are a key part of the process that ensures DNA is accurately copied and distributed in the vast majority of cell divisions.
So cells go through a life cycle, much like people do. It goes through 3 parts of its life cycle. The longest part of a cell's life is what we call interphase. Interphase is where that cell is just living its life. It's carrying out its everyday functions. If it's a liver cell, then it's being a liver cell. It's part of the liver. If it's a kidney cell, it's being part of the kidney, filtering your blood. If it's, a skin cell, it's just doing its thing as part of your skin. So interphase is like the main part of a cell's life. It's the longest part of a cell's life. Towards the end of interphase, when that cell gets ready to divide, so it's going to get ready to go from one to making a copy of itself, this is where the DNA will replicate. So the cell is going to grow, it's going to carry out its normal functions, but then towards the end, DNA will replicate or duplicate, meaning like it's going to make a copy of all of that genetic material that's in the nucleus. Then the cell goes through mitosis, and mitosis is the process of actual dividing all of that genetic material. So it's going to go through mitosis, where that nucleus from that one parent cell will divide into 2. And each of the 2 new daughter nuclei are going to get exact copies of the original DNA, hopefully, unless there's a mutation. But both of the new nuclei, ideally, will have identical DNA to each other, which will be identical to what the parent originally had. The last part of a cell's cycle is cytokinesis. Cytokinesis is just that moment where those 2 daughter cells officially split, or those 2 nuclei officially split and become 2 new daughter cells. So this is the moment where either the cell membrane or the cell wall in a plant cell will actually divide and grow and cut off those cells from each other, and now they're officially 2 new cells. Again, in animal cells, it's what we call a cell membrane, because animal cells are a little bit more movable. And in plant cells, which are a little bit more rigid, because plants don't have bones like a lot of animals do, in plant cells, a cell plate will grow, which will turn into a cell wall that builds up to separate officially those 2 daughter cells from each other, to make them 2 completely separate cells from each other. This diagram here, there's one similar to it in your book. This just shows, this is how long interphase is in a cell's life. Interphase takes up the majority of a cell's life cycle. This is where, like I said, it's going to be carrying out its normal everyday functions, the purpose of its life. Mitosis is the process of organizing and dividing that genetic material. And then cytokinesis is, okay, now I've got 2 new daughter cells. And then each of those 2 daughter cells are going to go through their own interphases, mitosis and cytokinesis. This is a video from the Amoeba Sisters, where they'll talk about the cell cycle and how that kind of relates to cancer, because cancer is typically a mutation where a cell doesn't know to stop dividing and to go through that interphase. The cells just continue to divide.
Today's topic is the cell cycle and mitosis. But before we get into the cell cycle and mitosis, we want to make sure and talk about why these words are important and how they relate to real life. So if I say the word cancer, This word probably means something to you. Either you know somebody who's been diagnosed with cancer or you've heard about it on the news. There's many different types of cancers, but one thing they all have in common is that they are caused by uncontrolled cell growth. That means somebody's own cells grow out of control. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other contributing factors. For example, for some cancers, having genetic links, meaning it runs in the family, can make somebody more likely to develop it. Or having excessive exposure to UV light for some cancers. Those are risk factors that can increase your risk, but the major cause of cancer is uncontrolled cell growth. That also means it's something that is not contagious, and it's something that anyone can develop. You have to realize that all the cells in your body are very, very busy, and they're either in one of two different phases. They are either in a phase called interphase, and during interphase, they are just growing, they're replicating their DNA, they're doing their cell functions, or they are in mitosis. Mitosis is a fancy word that means that they are dividing, they are making new cells. Well, if you think about the cell cycle, whether they're in interphase or mitosis, it's kind of like a pie graph. They're spending about 90% of their time in interphase. Most of the time, cells are not dividing. Most of the time, cells are in interphase. They're growing, they're doing their daily cell functions, and they're replicating their DNA. Most of the time, cells are not dividing. Now, depending on what kind of cell, it might do mitosis more or less often. For example, your hair follicle cells, they do mitosis frequently, which is why your hair can grow up to half an inch every month. But other cells, like, for example, your brain cells, your neurons, some of them actually do not perform mitosis, which is why if you have some type of major injury to the spinal cord or to the brain, sometimes those do not heal very well because those cells, they do not replicate. So mitosis is very important in order to generate new cells, which can help with growth, and also if you damage your cells. If you're walking down the street and you have some kind of accident and you skin your knee, well, you're going to need to repair those damaged cells. You're going to need to be able to do mitosis to make those new cells. The thing is, you don't want your cells to always be doing mitosis, because if they're always doing mitosis, then they're always dividing, and then they're not carrying out their actual function. And that's a problem. That's where checkpoints come in handy. See, along the cell cycle, there are checkpoints to check that the cell is growing correctly and replicating its DNA correctly and doing everything it's supposed to do correctly before it divides. And what happens if the cell fails its checkpoint? The cell does something called apoptosis, which basically means the cell destroys itself. It self-destructs. This might seem kind of harsh, but actually it's really important because it ensures that you don't have these cells that are messed up continue on and divide. You don't want damaged cells to continue on and divide because they might not do what they're supposed to. They might start to grow out of control. They might not be regulated correctly. That's where cancer cells come in. See, cancer cells, as we had said, are your body's own cells that are growing out of control. So they're not following the rules of these checkpoints. They're flying past the checkpoints, going through the cell cycle, and frequently doing mitosis, which means that they're dividing very, very often. And so by doing that, they can grow into these things called tumors, which are really a mass of cancer cells. So we're not really sure what causes them to escape these checkpoints. There's a lot of risk factors that that a person can have that can increase their risk of this happening, but when these cells get past these checkpoints and grow out of control, they become a problem because many times they can travel through the bloodstream, they start growing out of control, the body can't identify them and destroy them with the immune system. So this becomes an issue. And usually one of the treatments that somebody who has cancer will undergo is chemotherapy. And this works by targeting cells that go through the cell cycle quickly and hit mitosis quickly. And that's one reason why somebody often will lose their hair when they're on chemotherapy, because they're on this medication that's targeting fast-growing cells, and your hair follicle cells are also fast-growing cells. Cancer cells have some other factors that make them difficult to treat. One is that cancers have the ability to secrete their own growth hormone. This is very bad because growth hormone, in a sense, think of it as a hormone that says, feed me. And what happens is the blood vessels will divert over to those cancer cells and supply the cancer cells with nutrients. This is not good because this means the cancer cells will have the nutrients they need to keep growing out of control. It also can take nutrients away from nearby healthy cells. There's some medications that are being researched that maybe could stop the growth hormone from cancer cells. And in a sense, that would be great because the cancer cells would not be able to get the nutrients to grow out of control anymore. Of course, you have to make sure that the medication is targeting just the cancer cells and that you're not affecting the growth hormone of nearby healthy cells. You wouldn't want that. So it's kind of a tricky situation. So let's recap what we talked about today. We talked about the cell cycle, how cells are more frequently in interphase than they are mitosis. Interphase is when cells are replicating their DNA or they're growing, carrying out cell processes. In mitosis, the cells are actually dividing. We talked about how during this cell cycle, there's checkpoints that regulate the cell and keep the cell from being able to continue on if it's damaged. Unless we're talking about cancer cells, which are cells that have escaped the checkpoints and are growing out of control. Be sure to check out our clip on mitosis. This process is really fascinating, but it's also a really important one in order to understand how your body cells work. That's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
Okay, so let's go back to this diagram here. Like we said, the longest part of a cell's life is interphase. But then it goes through mitosis. Mitosis is that process of that cell splitting up its DNA into two new nuclei. Mitosis itself has a few stages to it. The first two stages are prophase and metaphase. Prophase happens when that spaghetti ball of yarn mixture of DNA organizes itself into those nice X-shaped chromosomes that we see here in this picture. So during interphase, most of that DNA, like I said, just looks like a mess of stuff, like just a ball of string that's just been thrown in the nucleus. Prophase is where those chromosomes get organized and they form. We see those little legs get tied together by their little belt in the middle there, and they just look like these nice little X shapes. And if you were to look at them under a high-powered microscope, they would look something similar to what you see on this picture on this slide. Also during prophase, that nucleus that was holding all that DNA and that genetic material in, that nucleus is going to start to kind of dissolve and become a part of the cell. So that nucleus is going to disappear. This is going to leave room for all of those chromosomes to really organize themselves and to move to opposite sides of the cell. The next phase of mitosis is called metaphase. Okay. This happens when those chromosomes line up in the middle. That's how I remember metaphase. Metaphase, they line up in the middle. So you can see here on our diagram of metaphase, metaphase has all of our chromosomes lined up on the equator of the cell, and they're getting kind of pulled apart by these guys on opposite ends of the cell by these spindle fibers. I kind of think of the spindle fibers as like fishing lines, okay? Because in the next part of mitosis, you'll see them start to get pulled apart. But remember, metaphase is where chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell. The next phase here we have is anaphase. Anaphase, is where those chromosomes get pulled apart. So those two little legs that were tied together by that belt, they get separated from each other. And they're going to move to opposite sides of the cell. That's how I remember anaphase. Anaphase, they're moving apart. Anaphase, apart. The last phase of mitosis is called telophase. I know it looks like it should be pronounced telophase, but most scientists pronounce it telophase. Telophase is where we start to see our two new nuclei forming in what will become our two new daughter cells. So now that the chromosomes are starting to split to opposite ends of the cell, now they're starting to get encased in some new nuclear membranes so that those two daughter cells can then split off from each other and become two new cells of their own. So we'll start to see the cell membrane start to pinch, or if it's an animal cell, maybe you'll see a cell plate start to form there in the middle. And then the nuclear membranes are going to start forming to close in that DNA, that genetic material. This is an animation of
mitosis begins as the long threads of DNA in the nucleus start to coil. Having already replicated, these threads emerge as the double strands we know as chromosomes. Meanwhile, protein fibers grow from the migrating centrioles, forming a latticework of spindles. For reasons scientists don't fully understand, the nuclear membrane suddenly disintegrates. With amazing accuracy, a spindle from each centriole attaches itself to each of the chromosomes. Assisted by the protein fibers, the chromosomes move center stage. In a microscopic tug of war, the spindles pull each chromatid toward opposite poles. Other spindles push against each other in a ratcheting action that stretches the cell. The chromosomes then unwind and the nuclear membranes reform. With mitosis complete, the nuclei and cytoplasm separate, creating two new cells in this ongoing cycle that sustains all life.
So this very last slide here is just showing you all the different phases of a cell's life, just kind of put them all together. But again, interphase is where just the cell, I know it looks like it's just part of the mitosis situation here, but interphase is where the cell is going to spend most of its life. And the DNA is just this jumble of string. And you can see that in this diagram here. Then these next four phases are all part of mitosis: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. Prophase is where that DNA gets organized into chromosomes, so the chromosomes form. Metaphase, those chromosomes line up in the middle. Anaphase, they get pulled apart. Telophase, we see two new nuclei starting to form. The last part of a cell's life is cytokinesis, which again is just where either that cell membrane splits off and officially we have two new daughter cells, or if it's a plant cell, a cell wall will get built up and it's officially two new daughter cells. So cytokinesis isn't shown on this slide, but it's just, imagine this for telophase, this last diagram here, just completely pinching off instead of just indenting. So this is our section on mitosis. You're going to see a lot of very similar information in 5.2 when we talk about meiosis. A lot of the phase names are very, very similar, but meiosis happens for a very different reason. We'll talk about that in 5.2.